Modern history has been shaped by conquest. The conquest of the world by Europeans. The conquistadors led the way. A few hundred men who came to the New World and decimated the native population. The secret of their success? Guns, germs, and steel. Ever since, people of European origin have dominated the globe with the same combination of military power, lethal microbes, and advanced technology. But how did they develop these advantages in the first place? Why did the world ever become so unequal? These are questions that Professor Jared Diamond has spent more than 30 years trying to answer. One of the most original thinkers of our age, Diamond has traveled the world looking for clues. He set himself a daunting task: to peel back the layers of the past and explore the very roots of power in the modern world.
Whatever I work on for the rest of my life, I can never work on questions as fascinating as the questions of guns, germs, and steel, because they're the biggest questions of human history.
What separates the haves from the have-nots? How have guns, germs, and steel shaped the history of the world? Jared Diamond's quest to uncover the roots of inequality began in the rainforests of Papua New Guinea.
Oh, you look up. Oh.
Diamond is a professor at UCLA in Los Angeles. He's a biologist by training, a specialist in human physiology. But his real passion has always been the study of birds.
I love watching birds in this place. I began watching birds when I was 7 years old in the United States. Then it was just a matter of identifying them. I came here when I was 26 years old to New Guinea, and it was love at first sight. Look.
Diamond has been making regular trips to New Guinea ever since.
Why squirty?
And is now a leading expert on the bird life of the island.
Morning, Wantok.
But in the course of his field work, he's become just as curious about the people of New Guinea.
You go find a fish. 20 fish you got? That's old number 2 bush pal cry going. Over the years, I've gotten to know and like thousands of New Guineans. The name belong again, you talk? Name Yanai. I've learned several of their languages, and much of what I know about birds I picked up from them.
Because of hard work.
There have been people living in New Guinea for at least 40,000 years. Much longer than on the continents of North and South America. Look 'em. Look 'em, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Pella. They're among the most culturally diverse and adaptable people in the world. So why are they so much poorer than modern Americans?
The question was put to Diamond bluntly by a man called Yali, whom he met on a beach more than 30 years ago.
Why you white men have so much cargo and we New Guineans have so little?
Yali's question really threw me. It seemed so simple and obvious, and I thought it must have a simple and obvious answer. But when he asked me, I had no idea what that answer was.
Why you white men have so much cargo and we New Guineans have so little?
New Guineans use the word cargo to describe the material goods first brought to their country by Westerners. Cargo was regarded by many as evidence of the white man's power. It was treated with an almost religious reverence. For their part, Western colonials typically believed that power was determined by race. They saw themselves as genetically superior to the native population. To them, it was only natural that they should have so much cargo and New Guineans so little.
To me, any explanation based on race is absurd. I know too many really smart New Guineans to believe there's anything genetically inferior about them. It's their ingenuity and their quickness to learn that have always impressed me. They can go empty-handed into some of the most difficult environments on Earth, knock up a shelter in a few hours and survive. Me try and dispel a step. Dispel a rope, be strong and up and up and up and up. I wouldn't know where to start. In this environment, I'd be helpless without them. So why didn't these ingenious people invent metal tools, or build great cities, or develop any of the other trappings of modern civilization? The world that I'm from is so different. The modern U.S. is the richest, most powerful state on Earth. It's crammed with more cargo than most New Guineans could ever imagine. But why? That's what Yali wanted to know. How did our worlds ever become so different?
Diamond realized that Yali's question was far bigger and more complex than it first appeared. It was really about the roots of inequality. A question as old as human history itself.
Why, since ancient times, have some societies progressed faster than others? What allowed the Egyptians to build great pyramids while most of the world was still scratching out a living? How did the Greeks ever develop such an advanced civilization? Or the Romans? Or the Maya? All great civilizations have had some things in common: advanced technology, large populations, and a well-organized workforce. If I could understand how those things came into existence, then I'd understand why some people marched faster than others during the course of history.
Diamond set out to explore the division of the world into haves and have-nots. It was a massive challenge that few scholars would have dared take on. He was a scientist, not a historian. How could he possibly solve the great puzzles of human history? To understand where inequality came from, one day in November 1532, the New World and the Old World collided.
¿Cómo te atreves, indio perro?
168 Spaniards attacked the imperial army of the Incas in the highlands of Peru. Before the day was out, they had massacred 7,000 people and taken control of the Inca Empire. Not a single Spanish life was lost in the process. Why was the balance of power so uneven between Old World and New? And why, in the centuries that followed, were Europeans the ones who conquered so much of the globe? These are questions that fascinate Professor Jared Diamond. He is on a quest to understand the roots of power, searching for clues in the most unlikely places. He's developed a highly original theory that what separates the winners from the losers is the land itself, geography. It was the shape of the continents, their crops and animals, that allowed some cultures to flourish, while others were left behind. But can this way of seeing the world shed light on the events of 1532? How can geography explain the conquest of the world by guns, germs, and steel? For 2 years, a band of Spanish conquistadors has been traveling in search of gold and glory. They're not professional soldiers, but mercenaries and adventurers, led by a retired army captain, Francisco Pizarro. He's already made a fortune for himself in the colonies of Central America. Now he's taking his men south into unknown territory. They are the first Europeans to have climbed the Andes and ventured this far into the continent of South America. As they travel, they find evidence of a large native civilization. They've reached the edge of the mighty Inca Empire. For Indians and Spaniards alike, any encounter is a clash of cultures. These Indians have never seen white men before and have no idea of the threat they represent. They can't imagine that within a few days, these strangers will turn their world upside down. By the 1530s, the Inca Empire was enormous. It stretched along the length of the Andes, from modern-day Ecuador to central Chile, a distance of 2,500 miles. But just 500 miles to the north began the colonies of Central America and the Caribbean, prized possessions of the Spanish Empire. At the time, the Spanish king controlled a third of mainland Europe, but Spain itself had only recently become a unified state, having fought off 700 years of occupation by Islamic Moors. it was still a rural society. Most of the conquistadors came from villages and small towns in the heart of the country. Towns like Trujillo, where Pizarro grew up. He spent much of his childhood here, working as a swineherd in the fields nearby. Today he's remembered as a great warrior. His statue dominates the main square in Trujillo. And his family home has been turned into a museum. Jared Diamond has come here to explore the world of the conquistadors and understand the secret of their success.
This is Francisco Pizarro, a Spaniard who conquered the most powerful state in the New World, the Inca Empire. Why did Pizarro and his men conquer the Incas instead of the other way around? It seems like a simple question. The answer isn't immediately obvious. After all, Pizarro started out as a rather ordinary person, and Trujillo here is a rather ordinary town. So what is it that gave Pizarro and his men this enormous power? Why am I so interested in Pizarro's conquistadors? Because their story is such a grimly successful example of European conquest. And for 30 years, I've been exploring patterns of conquest.
Jared Diamond is a professor at UCLA in Los Angeles. But most of his fieldwork has been done in Papua New Guinea. His time there inspired him to explore the roots of inequality in the modern world, to understand why some people have been able to dominate and conquer others. Looking back thousands of years, he argues that farming gave some cultures an enormous head start. And those who were lucky enough to have the most productive crops and animals became the most productive farmers. Agriculture first developed in a part of the Middle East known as the Fertile Crescent. Over time, crops and animals from the Fertile Crescent spread into North Africa and Europe, where they triggered an explosion of civilization. By the 16th century, European farms were dominated by livestock animals that had come from the Fertile Crescent. None were native to Europe. They provided more than just meat. They were a source of milk and wool, leather and manure. And crucially, they provided muscle power. Harnessed to a plow, a horse or an ox could transform the productivity of farmland. European farmers were able to grow more food to feed more people, who could then build bigger and more complex societies. In the New World, there were no horses or cattle for farming. All the work had to be done by hand. The only large domestic animal was the llama, but these docile creatures had never been harnessed to a plow. The Incas were very skilled at growing potatoes and corn, but because of their geography, they could never be as productive as European farmers. Horses gave Europeans another massive advantage. They could be ridden. To the Incas, the sight of Pizarro's conquistadors passing through their land is extraordinary. They've never seen people carried by their animals before. Some think they are gods, these strange-looking men, part human, part beast. The horses that seemed so exotic to the Incas had already been used in Spain for 4,000 years. In an age before motorized transport, they allowed people to be mobile and control their land. When Javier Martin is not herding cattle, he gives displays of traditional Spanish horsemanship. This style of riding is known as jineta. The emphasis is on control and maneuverability, using bent knees to grip the sides of the horse and only one hand on the reins. Very different from the more formal style of medieval knights. By the 16th century, the jineta way of riding had become the dominant style of the Spanish cavalry. This is how the conquistadors would have ridden their horses.
It's an amazing display of a big animal being controlled by a person, precise control, stopping and starting and turning. Javier told me that he has been riding since he was 5 years old, and when I watched this, I have a better understanding of where the conquistadors were coming from. They were masters of these techniques, and they learned these techniques for working with bulls, but the techniques were also good in a military context as well, and I can see that this control would let you ride down people in the open. People who had never seen horses before would have been absolutely terrified watching this. It would be strange and frightening, and that's even before one of these animals is rushing towards you, riding you down, about to lance you and kill you.
News of the godlike strangers on their four-legged animals is taken by royal messenger to the emperor of the Incas, who's camped in the valley of Cajamarca in northern Peru, guarded by an army of 80,000 men. Atahualpa is revered as a living god, a son of the sun itself. He's in Cajamarca on a religious retreat, giving thanks for a series of recent military triumphs. When he hears about the progress of the Spaniards, he chooses not to have them killed. Instead, he sends back a message. He invites them to join him in Cajamarca as quickly as possible.
Atahualpa wanted the Spaniards to come to Cajamarca and enter into a trap. And to be sure that they would do so, he played like a psychological game with them, sending presents, asking them to come. Atahualpa knew that the Spaniards were not gods. The intelligence reports speak of people wearing wool on their faces, like a llama, like an alpaca, that is like an animal. Then they went from one place to the other wearing on top of their heads a little pot that has never been used for cooking. You need to be crazy to walk with a pot. But you must be beyond salvation if you arrive to a camp and you don't use that pot to cook. Atahualpa had an idea that these were subhumans. What could a few horsemen and 100 and so Spaniards do to the powerful Inca? Virtually nothing.
But Atahualpa's spies don't realize that the Spanish are armed with some of the best weapons in the world. At the time of the conquistadors, Spain had the biggest army in Europe, orchestrated from the imperial capital, Toledo. For more than 700 years, the Spaniards had been at war, fighting against the Moors and other European armies. There was an arms race in Europe. To survive, the Spaniards needed to keep up with the latest in weapons technology.
Hey!
By the 1530s, the harquebus was an important part of the Spanish arsenal. Gunpowder had originally come from China, but its use as a weapon was pioneered by the Arabs. In European hands, guns became lighter and more portable, and were used for the first time by foot soldiers on the battlefield. The harquebus was still a crude weapon, but would go on to change the face of warfare.
To us, moderns, this gun doesn't seem useful for anything. It's like a joke. Its aim is terrible. It takes a long time to reload, and while the shooter's reloading, an swordsman would come in and kill him. But the Incas hadn't even gotten this far, and even this gun, with its sound and with the smell and with the smoke and with every now and then a person that it manages to kill, would have been terrifying to someone who had never seen this before. This would have been shock and awe, 1532 style.
For all its bluster, the technology of gunpowder was still in its infancy. The real power of the conquistadors lay elsewhere, with the production of steel. Toledo had some of the best swordsmiths in the world. But why were people here able to craft deadly steel weapons, while the Incas were still making simple bronze tools?
There was nothing innately brilliant about Europeans themselves that allowed them to be the ones to make high-quality swords. Just as with guns, swords were the result of a long process of trial and error that began outside Europe. People started working with metal in the Fertile Crescent 7,000 years ago. And because Europe was geographically close to the Fertile Crescent, Europeans inherited this metal technology. But they took this technology on to a new level. European soldiers demanded stronger, longer, sharper swords. This is what a Toledo sword looks like when it's finished. This particular one is modeled on the sword that Pizarro carried. It's a fearsome weapon. It's used for stabbing, and it's also used for slashing. And I can easily understand how the person wielding the sword could kill dozens of people within a short time.
Swords like this
rapiers represented a high point in a very sophisticated metalworking technology. You think about what the qualities are that are needed in a sword. First of all, it has to be hard enough, the metal has to be hard enough to take a sharp edge. And that requires steel. That is iron infused with carbon. And the more carbon you put into the iron, then the harder the metal is. But if you make it too hard, then it's brittle. And that's no good because as you hit somebody, your sword would break. And so you also need your sword to have a certain pliability, an ability to bend and spring back into shape. And it's got by heating it to certain temperatures, plunging it into cold water. Immense amount of experimentation. It took centuries to get to the level of sophistication where you could get something so long and elegant and fine and deadly as the rapier.
The rapier, with its extra-long blade, was developed as a dueling weapon, but became so fashionable in Renaissance Europe, it was the sword of choice for any aspiring gentleman.
The word rapier derives from the Spanish term espada ropera, and that means dress sword. And for the first time in Spain, we start to see people wearing the sword with their everyday clothing, their civilian dress, going about their everyday business. They didn't do that in the Middle Ages. This is something new in the 16th century. And it's saying, I have arrived, I am a gentleman, I am upwardly mobile, and I claim ancestry from the knights of the Middle Ages. It was very much a symbol of the conquistadors' aspiring greed. The thing that drove them through all their hardships, the thing that made them go to the Americas was their lust for gold, their lust for self-advancement. And the rapier absolutely symbolized that overbearing avarice.
On November 15th, 1532, Pizarro's band of adventurers enters the valley of Cajamarca. They've been told that Atahualpa is waiting for them here, but they're not prepared for the sight that greets them. In the hills beyond the town of Cajamarca is the Imperial Inca army, 80,000 men in full battle order. The conquistadors' own journals bear witness to their first impressions.
Their camp looked like a very beautiful city. We'd seen nothing like it in the Indies until then. And it scared us, because we were so few and so deep in this land.
Pizarro sends a party of his best horsemen into the heart of the Inca camp. They are led by Captain de Soto. They are gambling that Atahualpa will allow them to pass through the camp unharmed, and agree to meet them.
Soto's visit had a very important psychological purpose: to intimidate the Inca in front of his people, challenging him with a horse. Atahualpa at first didn't react to Soto's presence, as if nobody had entered the room. Once the horse comes eye to eye with the Inca is still calm, showing that the horse has no impact on him, calling Soto's bluff.
The captain advanced so close that the horse's nostrils disturbed the fringe on the Inca's forehead. But the Inca never moved.
And then, after a brief silence, comes Atahualpa's explosion. He was telling them, the time has come for you to pay. I understand this as the time has come for you to pay with your lives.
Pakaring, umalik ni Kichiswan tupasak. Umalik ni Kichiswan.
Soto, I understand, was nervous enough to come back with fear to the camp. And as we know, the Spaniards spent the night before in extreme fear.
The conquistadors have made their camp in the town of Cajamarca. Many of them are now convinced they are facing oblivion. 168 soldiers, 1,000 miles from any other Spaniard, facing an army of 80,000 Incas.
Few of us slept that night. We kept watch in the square, from where we could see the campfires of the Indian army. It was a fearful sight, like a brilliantly star-studded night.
Pizarro and his most trusted officers debate their options for how to deal with Atahualpa.
Pero hay un montón de soldados, capitán, no vamos a poder.
Some advise caution, but Pizarro insists their best chance is to launch a surprise attack the next day. It's a tactic that's worked successfully in the past. 12 years before Pizarro went to Peru, another famous conquistador, Hernán Cortés, had gone to Mexico and encountered another formidable civilization, the Aztecs. He conquered the country by kidnapping the Aztec leader and exploiting the ensuing chaos. Cortés's story was later published and became a bestseller, a handbook for any would-be conquistador. It can still be found in the great library of Salamanca University in northern Spain.
This wonderful library here can be thought of, among other things, as a repository of dirty tricks, because in these books are the accounts of what generals had been doing to other generals for thousands of years in the past and across much of Eurasia. And here from this library we have a famous account of the conquest of Mexico with all the details of what Cortés did to the Aztecs and what worked. That was a model for Pizarro to give him ideas what exactly to try out on the Incas, whereas the Incas, without writing, had only local knowledge transmitted by oral memory, and they were unsophisticated and naive compared to the Spaniards because of writing.
But if books were so useful, why couldn't the Incas read or write? To develop a new system of writing independently is an extremely complex process, and has happened very rarely in human history. It was first achieved by the Sumerian people of the Fertile Crescent at least 5,000 years ago. They pioneered an elaborate system of symbols called cuneiform, possibly as a way of recording farming transactions. Ever since, almost every other written language of Europe and Asia has copied, adapted, or simply been inspired by the basics of cuneiform. The spread of writing was helped enormously by the invention of paper, ink, and movable type. Innovations that all came from outside Europe, but were seized upon by Europeans in the Middle Ages to produce the ultimate transmitter of knowledge, the printing press. The written word could now spread quickly and accurately across Europe and Asia. The modern world would be impossible without the development of writing. But there's another part of the world where a new system of writing was invented independently. In southern Mexico, at least 2,500 years ago, native people developed a way of working with symbols that evolved into the Mayan script. But if the Maya had writing, why didn't it spread south to the Andes and help the Incas become literate? For Diamond, the answer lies in the shape of the continents.
Here are Europe and Asia forming the continent of Eurasia, a giant continent, but it's stretched out from east to west and narrow from north to south. The American continent is long from north to south, narrow from east to west, very narrow at Panama, where it narrows down to less than 100 miles. The two continents are of the same length, about 8,000 miles in maximum dimensions, but Eurasia is 8,000 miles from east to west, and the Americas are 8,000 miles from north to south. It's as if these continents were rotated 90 degrees of each other.
Diamond has already shown that crops and animals could spread easily east and west across Eurasia. Because places at the same latitude automatically share the same day length and a similar climate and vegetation. But the American continents were the opposite of Eurasia. A journey from one end of the Americas to the other is a journey from north to south. A journey through different day lengths, different climate zones, and dramatically different vegetation. These basic differences hindered the spread of crops and animals, as well as people, ideas, and technologies. The people of the Andes were chronically isolated, without access to writing or almost any other innovation from elsewhere in the Americas. By contrast, Pizarro and his men were geographically blessed. As Spaniards, they enjoyed the benefit of technologies and ideas that had spread easily across Eurasia.
The events of 1532 were clearly influenced by deep causes over which no individual Spaniard or Inca had any control. The shape of the continents, the distribution of plants and animals, the spread of Eurasian technology. These were facts of geography. And at almost every turn of the drama, geography was tilted in favor of Europeans.
It's the morning of November 16th, 1532. Atahualpa has agreed to meet the Spaniards in the town of Cajamarca and sends his entourage ahead of him. But he makes a fateful decision, that his soldiers should not carry weapons.
The Indians were musicians and dancers. They were soldiers, but unarmed. Why would Atahualpa unarm his own soldiers? Why? Because he was in a festivity. He was celebrating. He wasn't going to war. He was going for a celebration so that the whole people could see how the alleged gods would run away in fear. The fact that some people believed that the Spaniards were gods would play better in the hands of Atahualpa's purpose. If I know they are not gods and I defeat the gods, then of course everybody will be with me. But what if I defeat the gods with no show of force at all? Then I am beyond the gods.
While Atahualpa and his men enter Cajamarca, the Spaniards are waiting, hidden from view.
There were 5,000 or 6,000 men, and behind them the figure of Atahualpa seated on a very fine litter, lined with feathers and embellished with gold and silver. Many of us pissed ourselves out of sheer terror.
The square is filled with Atahualpa's people, but there's not one Spaniard outside. Atahualpa asks, "Where are these dogs?" One of his right hands answers, "They have run away because they are afraid of the magnificent Inca." Of course, the whole crowd listened to this and believed that this was the case.
Me presento ante vosotros en nombre de la cristiandad.
Pizarro sends out his priest to confront Atahualpa.
Para enseñaros el camino de la verdad.
The conquistadors are obliged to try and convert native people before any resort to violence.
Pinkanki sun kasapa. Mokakakani intech churingmi. Mokankani intitaitach churing. Manang imaparuanay kichu kay peja.
Mi poder procede de mi Señor. Sus palabras están escritas en este libro.
Imankaipi.
Atahualpa has never seen a book before. He doesn't know what to do with it.
Imangkay. Manang imapas chukeka. Manang rimas kay kikay pikanchu.
¿Cómo te atreves, indio perro? ¡Salgan, españoles! ¡Destruyen a estos perros que no respetan las cosas de Dios! ¡Santiago, a ellos!
At that moment, with the crowd absolutely unprepared, the horses come. There was massive panic.
Just imagine the scene in Cajamarca. The Incas hadn't seen horses before, and these aren't ordinary horses, these are Spanish horses. Fierce, big, fighting horses. They could get in amongst men, they would trample men, and they made the most excellent platform. From a horse, you could stab down to the left, stab down to the right. You could cut, you could scythe, hacking all about you. If only the Incas had known that what you had to do against cavalry was stand firm, then they'd have been all right. They had superior numbers, but they didn't know that. They fled, they broke ranks, and then the horsemen could get in amongst them, and they cut them down. There was an Inca god called Viracocha, and he was a white man, and he was the god of thunder. And they thought these men with their arquebuses were the very incarnation of Viracocha.
The Inca force was in his litter, helped by his carriers. As soon as they were able to do it, the Spaniards went after the litter. And they started killing the carriers. One carrier would fall, and another one would replace him. Only at the very, very, very end of the tragedy, the litter started to move because there were no more carriers left.
As the litter falls, Pizarro himself captures Atahualpa. His plan has worked to perfection. Atahualpa is taken to a makeshift prison in the royal quarters at Cajamarca.
He thought we were going to kill him, but we told him no. Christians only killed in the heat of the battle.
Outside, thousands of Incas are dead. The rest of the army has retreated to the hills. In spite of a massive imbalance in numbers, Spanish horses, swords, and strategy have proved decisive. But the Spaniards possessed another weapon they didn't even know they had. A weapon of mass destruction that had marched invisibly ahead of them. Today, the war against infectious disease is waged at biological research centers like Porton Down in southern England. They produce vaccines here against the world's deadliest viruses. In the 16th century, there were no vaccines, and there was no protection from the rampant spread of infectious disease. "12 years before Pizarro arrived at Cajamarca, a Spanish ship sailed to Mexico. On board, one of the slaves was suffering from the first signs of a fever. He was the first person to bring a deadly disease to the American mainland. The disease was smallpox. Within weeks, the smallpox virus would spread from a single source to infect thousands of Native Americans.
Smallpox gets into the body when you breathe in the particles, and they attach themselves to the back of your throat and the inside of your lungs. About 2 to 3 days into the illness, then the classic rash appears. And in its worst forms, this takes over the whole of the body with initially pimples and then enormous blisters until the whole of the skin, starting with the hands and the face and then spreading down to cover the rest of the body, is taken over by the smallpox blisters. From that time on, the patient is highly infectious. Because each of those blisters is packed full of smallpox particles, then if you burst the blister, the fluid will come out and large numbers of viruses will be spilled onto whatever it touches. "10 to 12 days later, his friends would begin to be taken ill, and then 10 to 12 days after that, their friends. That kind of rate means the disease spreads exponentially. Its rate of increase gets bigger and bigger and bigger the more people are infected, until eventually it will cause tremendous devastation in the population.
The first smallpox epidemic of the New World swept through Central America and reached the Inca Empire. Wherever it went, the virus decimated native populations, making them easier prey for Spanish conquest. But why were the germs so one-sided? Why did the Spaniards pass their diseases on to the Incas and not the other way around?
This is Pizarro's secret weapon. Pigs and cows, sheep and goats, domestic animals. Remember that Pizarro was a swineherd. He grew up in huts like this, in intimate contact with domestic animals, breathing in their germs, drinking the germs in their milk, and it was from the germs of domestic animals that the killer diseases of humans evolved. For example, our flu evolved from a disease of pigs transmitted via chickens and ducks. We acquired measles from cattle. We acquired smallpox from domestic animals, so that these worst killers of human people were a legacy of 10,000 years of contact with our beloved domestic animals.
During the Middle Ages, infectious diseases swept through Europe and claimed millions of lives. But paradoxically, repeated epidemics made Europeans more resilient. In each outbreak, there were always some people who were genetically better able to fight off the virus. These people were more likely to survive and have children. In the process, they'd pass on their genetic resistance. Over centuries, whole populations acquired some degree of protection against the spread of diseases like smallpox, a protection the Incas never had.
When smallpox was taken to the New World, nobody in the New World had ever seen a disease like this before, so the number of people who were susceptible was much greater. There was no natural immunity, and so therefore the number of people who could both contract the disease and then spread it, and the number of people to receive it once it had been spread, was much higher. More people would die, and more people would be susceptible to catch it in the first place. It would spread rapidly throughout the population, and the death toll would be enormous.
Why hadn't Native Americans encountered smallpox before? And why didn't they have any deadly diseases of their own to pass on to the Spaniards? It's simply because they didn't have the same history of contact with farm animals. The Incas had llamas, but llamas aren't like European cows and sheep. They're not milked, they're not kept in large herds, and they don't live in barns and huts alongside humans. There was no significant exchange of germs between llamas and people.
The key to Diamond's argument is the distribution of farm animals around the world. Aside from the llama, all the large farm animals were native to Eurasia and North Africa. None was ever domesticated in North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Australia. As a result, the worst epidemic diseases were also native to Eurasia and North Africa, and were then spread around the world with deadly effect. There's been a long debate about the number of indigenous people who died in the Spanish conquest of the New World. Some scholars think there may have been a population of 20 million Native Americans, and the vast majority, perhaps 95%, were killed by Old World diseases. A continent virtually emptied of its people. After the initial shock of his capture, Atahualpa became a cooperative prisoner. He learned to speak Spanish and play chess with his captors. The Spaniards realized he was more useful to them alive than dead. He was allowed to re-establish his court and prison, as long as he ordered his people to accept Spanish rule. He also ordered them to melt down a vast amount of treasure. Pizarro had promised Atahualpa his freedom in return for the gold. It proved to be an empty promise. Having handed over 20 tons of gold and silver, Atahualpa was no longer useful to his captors. He was garroted to death in the same square where so many of his followers had been slaughtered 8 months earlier. With Atahualpa dead, the conquistadors went on to colonize the rest of Peru, relying on the power of their guns, germs, and steel. Gold from the Spanish colonies was brought back to Seville in southern Spain. There's little activity on the Guadalquivir River today, but in the 16th century, this was among the most important, busiest ports in the world. The steady flow of ships carrying treasure from the Americas helped Spain become one of the richest nations on earth. The conquistadors had changed forever the relationship between Old World and New.
I came to Spain to answer a question. Why did Pizarro and his men conquer the Incas instead of the other way around? There's a whole mythology that conquest and the European expansion in general resulted from Europeans themselves being especially brave or bold or inventive or smart, but the answers turn out to have nothing to do with any personal qualities of Europeans. Yeah, Pizarro and his men were brave, but there were plenty of brave Incas. Instead, Europeans were accidental conquerors. By virtue of their geographic location in history, they were the first people to acquire guns, germs, and steel.
By the end of the 19th century, European powers had ventured beyond the Americas and colonized Africa, Australia, and much of Asia. The process that began at Cajamarca had reached its logical conclusion. European guns, germs, and steel were reshaping the world. Africa. It's been called the birthplace of humanity, the land where our ancestors took their first steps, yet only recently revealed as the home of a vast tropical civilization. Cities and kingdoms once spread across the continent, then vanished, leaving barely a trace. What happened to this great achievement? Professor Jared Diamond has set out to explore the great patterns of human history. It's a journey that has taken him from the jungles of New Guinea to the snow-capped peaks of Peru. His quest? To understand why one people, Europeans, have conquered so much of the world. Diamond argues that the roots of European triumph stretch back thousands of years and rest on the power of geography. Geography gave Europeans the most productive crops and animals on the planet, and these allowed them to develop guns, germs, and steel. Three great forces of conquest that have shaped human history. Now, Diamond is setting out on the last stage of his quest to discover what happened when guns, germs, and steel came to Africa, and to ask what role these forces still play. But Diamond's journey will test much more than theories. It will also test the man himself. A Class 19D South African Railways steam locomotive, built Glasgow, Scotland, 1932. It is a testament to technology and human achievement. A tool built to carve a path across a continent. A lasting symbol of the triumph of European guns, germs, and steel. This engine and its tracks of steel will carry Jared Diamond through the story of Africa. It is a tale with its roots in ambition and greed, the peoples of Europe reaching out beyond their native lands in a quest for global conquest.
As Europeans expanded around the world, they conquered other people, they built railroads, they developed rich societies modeled on Europe. They had done this successfully in North America and South America and Australia. And then they arrived in Africa, and it looked as if the same thing was starting all over again.
But Africa would be different. A place of dangers and secrets hidden from these foreign invaders. The first European settlers arrived in southern Africa in the mid-1600s. They landed here in the Cape of Good Hope at the southernmost tip of the continent. They quickly established themselves in this new land, laying out farms, planting wheat and barley, ranching cattle and sheep.
This may sound strange, but it's from ordinary agriculture like this that my theory of guns, germs, and steel arose. My quest began more than 30 years ago on a trip to Papua New Guinea, when I began to try to understand why the people there lived so differently from Europeans and Americans. The beginnings of the answer, I realized, depended on farming. New Guineans had only a few native crops that they could grow and no native farm animals, while my ancestors, even 10,000 years ago, had been blessed with an abundance of domestic plants and animals. Over the centuries, this had given them a huge advantage that let them develop cities, nations, and even colonies abroad.
But southern Africa is 5,000 miles from Europe. How was it possible for the settlers to import European crops and animals to such a distant part of the world? As much as skill, it came down to good fortune. Geography had dealt the settlers an immensely lucky hand. They had stumbled across one of the few parts of the southern hemisphere that feels just like Europe, because the Cape and Europe lie at a similar latitude or distance from the equator. And this means that the temperature and climate of these widely separated regions are almost exactly the same. the Europeans were able to establish prosperous farms and settlements. Properties now owned by their descendants, people like Hempes Dutoit.
So your family has been here for centuries on this land. How do you feel about the land yourself then?
Well, I've always loved the land since childhood days, and agriculture has been in our family for so many generations.
Tell me about the history of this farm.
Well, the land was occupied in 1683. I mean, that was only a couple of years after the first settlers came to the Cape.
But settlers like the Dutoit knew that this was not an empty land. Even today, their farms turn up evidence of the Cape's original inhabitants, a people known as the Khoisan.
Oh, this is interesting. This is from the Stone Age.
Oh.
Prior to the occupation of this land in 1683 by the settlers, this land was most probably occupied by Khoisan people. These were the tools they used to scrape the skins when they tanned the skins.
Beautiful.
And you can see how nicely it fits into your hand.
Yeah.
With the arrival of Europeans, these native peoples were driven from their land. But they also faced an invisible and even more devastating agent of conquest. A force Diamond has identified as one of the greatest in human history: germs.
Realizing the importance of farming led me to the next big surprising discovery of guns, germs, and steel. Domesticated animals had given Europeans one advantage of which they were completely unaware. By living in close proximity to their livestock, they had become infected with viruses and germs of those animals, which evolved into diseases of humans. Through exposure over centuries, Europeans had developed some resistance to those diseases. But as Europeans spread around the world, they encountered peoples who didn't have that same resistance, and who then fell victim to devastating outbreaks of infection, especially of smallpox. In the Americas, millions of native people died from this one disease. And here in the Cape, it wrought the same havoc on the Khoisan peoples.
Through their farming and their germs, Europeans had established a firm foothold in the southern tip of Africa. Now they look to expand.
In the 1830s, there was a burst of the pioneer spirit, such as had been seen in the European expansion across North America and Australia. This time it was Dutch settlers, and these pioneers moved into the interior like the pioneers moving across North America and Australia.
Over the course of the 1830s, thousands of Dutch farmers, with their families and possessions loaded into wagons, left the Cape in search of new land to settle. They called themselves the Voortrekkers, and these pioneers all wielded another agent of European conquest: the gun.
This is a muzzle-loading rifle, typical of the weapon that every Voortrekker would have had in his wagon. The Boers were particularly adept at using this weapon. They could reload it and fire from horseback.
These muzzle-loading rifles are still much admired by the Voortrekkers' descendants.
Every single man that was in good health had at least 2 or 3 of these particular rifles.
In those days, it must have been the person's life, you know. Everything depended on that, you know.
They hunted with him.
Yes, he hunted
they
with him.
protected themselves with him.
It was part of him, you know. If you didn't handle a gun that day, there was something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Guns and the steel from which they're made were the last two of the great advantages that Europeans carried with them around the globe. Guns are the result of thousands of years of complex technological development, which began outside Europe, but which Europeans perfected. And that was all because of the head start that their farming had given them thousands of years previously.
You know, the flintlock rifle, it was, you know, I shouldn't really say this, but it was nearly like as important as a cell phone is today.
Yeah.
You can't go without your cell phone. In those days, you couldn't go without your flintlock rifle. Fire.
Armed as they were, the European settlers must have been confident they could overcome any obstacle as they pushed further into the African interior. By February 17, 1838, the Voortrekkers had reached 800 miles inland from the Cape. But they were entering an alien and unexplored land. Suddenly, out of the darkness swept a native African army. Their victims barely had time to fire a single shot from their rifles before they were completely overwhelmed. Within hours, nearly 300 Voortrekkers lay dead. Their enemy had struck without mercy. Killing men, women, and children alike. Who could have committed such a ruthless and calculated assault, stopping the Europeans in their tracks? In fact, the Voortrekkers had trespassed across the border of a mighty African kingdom, inhabited by people very different from the Khoisan of the Cape. They had encountered the Zulus.
When they ran into the Zulus, they ran into a group of people who were very different to anybody else they'd been up against up until that point in time. This was an organized group of people.
The Zulus were the authors of a unique and highly developed African state. Their military skills had allowed them to overwhelm their native African neighbors. They held more than 30,000 square miles of land and had established a sophisticated economy and society. The ferocity of the Zulu defense of their land was something the Voortrekkers had simply not expected.
It was more than the Boers could handle. They were not prepared for the attack from the Zulus. They were up against a king who could mobilize an army of 10 to 15,000 men without any problem at all. That could take on almost anybody. They were absolutely fearless.
The Voortrekkers were stunned and devastated. Had they and the power of guns, germs, and steel met their match in Africa? The Voortrekkers showed little interest in who the Zulus were, or how they developed such a sophisticated state. They wanted a showdown. They gathered their scattered forces behind a great circle of wagons and readied themselves for battle. At dawn on the 16th of December, 1838, more than 10,000 Zulus stormed across the horizon, charging in to destroy the outnumbered settlers. But this time, the Europeans were able to use their technology to maximum effect. To increase the rate of fire from their muzzle-loading rifles, some would shoot while others would reload.
It was shoot, hand the gun over, take the next gun, fire, hand the gun over. So every 5 or 6 seconds you could fire a shot. See, that was the important thing.
This time, not a single Zulu could get within 10 paces of the encampment. It was a massacre.
The Voortrekkers had probably killed an estimated 3,000 to 3,500 Zulus. The Boers themselves suffered only 3 injuries.
The conflict became known as the Battle of Blood River. The Zulus had been broken. Guns, germs, and steel had prevailed.
The victorious European settlers pushed on beyond Zulu lands, while new developments in their technology let them increase the pace of conquest. Railroads were key. With railroads, one could transport lots of people and their supplies over vast areas. And so in Africa, Europeans started to build railroads, move into the interior and transport themselves and their supplies.
This was the era of the Industrial Revolution, a revolution that introduced one further weapon to the colonization of Africa. A weapon that put the same devastating firepower seen at Blood River into the hands of just a single man.
This is a Maxim gun. What made this weapon such a great weapon as opposed to the old single-shot weapons that had been used in years before was this gun could fire continuously for up to 500 rounds a minute. It had the equivalent firepower of probably 100 men in a company with single-shot weapons.
As they drove further into Africa, Europeans encountered new tribes, some just as hostile to invasion as the Zulus had been. But for peoples like the Matabele, there was simply no answer to the world's first fully automatic weapon. The Matabele conflict of October 1893 lasted a matter of hours.
Settlers mowed down those Matabele warriors until there were only a few of them left. It was a real case of ancient technology up against the latest and greatest as far as European inventions were concerned.
It seemed like the birth of a new age. Europeans carving the path into the interior of Africa, conquering tribe after tribe, settling where they pleased. Guns, germs, and steel triumphant. Except now, those settlers would find themselves facing an entirely new enemy, one that had once been their greatest ally: geography.
As they moved north, settlers cleared land for farms, confident they could build a prosperous life in Africa. But with little warning, things began to go awry. The land became impossible to plow. Their crops refused to grow. Their shoes fell apart in the mud. And that was only the start.
Come on, man!
The second big problem that Europeans encountered was their animals died. Their horses and oxen had been a big part of the European advantage elsewhere in the world. Oxen as draft animals, and horses as their military animals. But here, the animals were dying.
For thousands of years, these domesticated animals and crops had sustained European civilization. Without them, there would have been no guns, germs, and steel. No history of conquest and colonization. And now, the settlers themselves began to fall ill with terrible fevers. While all around them, they could see native Africans farming, herding cattle, healthy and alive. How was this possible? What were the secrets of this strange new land?
The ideas behind guns, germs, and steel all spring from an understanding of geography. And geography explains why Europeans were now failing.
European crops had grown well in the Cape because the Cape was a mirror of the European world, lying on a similar latitude. But as the settlers progressed into the African interior, they'd been moving north, closer and closer to the equator. At about 23 degrees south, near the river Limpopo, they passed a major geographical boundary known as the Tropic of Capricorn. They were leaving behind their familiar European climate and entering a totally different world. They had entered the tropics. Compared to the European or temperate zones, the tropics operate by entirely different rules. Instead of the 4 seasons of Europe, North America, and the Cape, here there are just 2. The dry season and the rainy. Wheat and barley, the crops that had sustained European civilization for centuries, had not evolved to survive in this tropical climate. Yet the native Africans, the Zulus, the Matabele, all the tribes that the settlers had encountered, depended on agriculture just as much as the Europeans. How were they succeeding as the Europeans failed? Even today, the continent of Africa is composed of thousands of different tribal groupings. Each is subtly distinct from the next in custom and language.
Such diversity means that most Africans have to master more than one language, and they acquire those skills at a very young age. I would like to find out how many languages you speak. Who here knows how to speak Bemba? Aha! Does anybody else know how to understand or speak Lozi? You speak Lozi?
Yes.
Do you also speak Bemba?
Yes.
Is there another language that you speak also?
Lovan.
Lovan. That's 4 languages. That's good. Most Americans speak only one language. After a little exposure to these different languages, you begin to realize one thing. They all sound remarkably similar. I'm fascinated with languages, and wherever I've been going, I'm asking Africans, what's your language, and tell me some words in your language. So here's what I found out for the word for sun. In the Nyanja language, sun is Zuba. In the Bemba language, it's Akasuba. In Chiwa, it's Duzuba. And in the Senga language, it's Zuba again. Or the word for water. In the Nyanja language, it's Manzi. And in Bemba, it's Amenshi. And in Chiwa, it's Manzi, similar to each other again. What do these linguistic similarities tell us? That there is a common root for most of the modern languages of tropical Africa. A single ancestral language spoken by a single group of people from which the many languages of today have descended.
Linguistic analysis has isolated a family of languages known as Bantu, which originated in tropical West Africa. About 5,000 years ago, the early Bantu speakers began to spread into new lands, bringing their crops, their animals, and their language with them. And over centuries, Bantu culture evolved, diversifying into hundreds of tribes, expanding across the tropical region of Africa. But the truth of this Pan-African civilization was suppressed for many years. Dr. Alex Skirman is trying to overturn the legacy of South Africa's racist past. She has been excavating an archaeological site on the banks of the Limpopo River.
In the early part of the 20th century, there were rumors in the white South African community about this place, in their minds linked to the Queen of Sheba or some other early white civilization in southern Africa, trying to show that the Phoenicians or the Sabaeans, basically anybody who was a bit lighter skinned than Africans, were here first, and they found the opposite, that Africans actually had an amazing great history and that they had earlier states running way before any white set foot in Africa.
This site, known as Mapungubwe, the place of the jackal, formed the heart of the kingdom similar to the earliest civilizations in Europe.
Mapungubwe was the core, it was the capital of a massive state. About 5,000 people living around this hill. But then you had several thousand other people living in the valley who produced the agricultural surplus to feed the city or town. They had cattle, they had sheep, they grew sorghum, millet, they worked iron. It was a massive, amazing development that occurred in southern Africa.
And this was not an isolated state. It formed part of a much larger economic network that had spread across southern Africa and beyond.
These are Mapungubwe beads. They're gorgeous blue ones. These are glass beads that came down the Indian Ocean coast. And through them we know that Mapungubwe is part of the international trade network, linking it all the way to the coast. It's an incredible African accomplishment to set up such a complex trade network that links all the way into northern Botswana, bring material from there and taking it all the way to the Indian Ocean coast.
So, Africans had overcome the problems of agriculture that defeated the European settlers. They had developed a unique tropical system of agriculture that had spread across the continent and become the foundation of complex societies, trading as far afield as India.
But there was an even more extraordinary story at the heart of this flourishing tropical civilization. As soon as they entered the tropics, Europeans and their imported animals had fallen victim to terrible disease. Fevers racked their population. Yet tropical Africans showed fewer of the same effects. Many of them even survived that most lethal of European weapons, smallpox. The disease that had devastated the native peoples of North and South America and the Khoisan of the African Cape. How was this possible? Diamond believes it all comes back to geography. Many of the diseases that were killing the settlers and their European livestock were unique to the tropical world. They had never encountered them before. It was a complete reversal of the usual pattern of conquest.
In the New World, the germs had been a weapon on the side of Europeans, killing indigenous people. Here, it was indigenous germs to which Europeans had not a history of exposure. So here we have guns, germs, and steel again, but the germs working in the opposite direction, killing Europeans.
The settlers and their imported livestock had fallen victim to a host of tropical infections and diseases. But African cattle, over thousands of years, had developed resistance to many of these tropical germs. And these cattle might also explain why tropical Africans had not succumbed to smallpox on the same scale as the Khoisan people of the Cape. The smallpox virus originally crossed over from cattle to man centuries ago, and experts now believe it may have first originated in tropical Africa. Africans were certainly familiar with the disease. They had even developed methods of vaccination that bestowed an immunity for life. And there was more. Native Africans had also developed antibodies against one of the most virulent diseases on Earth: malaria. Carried by the humble mosquito, This was the disease that was now overwhelming the European settlers. But tropical Africans were combating malaria with more than just antibodies. Their entire civilization had evolved to help them avoid infection in the first place. They tended to settle in high or dry locations, away from the wet, humid areas where mosquitoes breed. And by living in relatively small communities, spread out over vast areas, Africans could limit the level of malaria transmission. It was an extraordinary achievement. But the Europeans understood little of the Africans' way of life. They built settlements by the rivers and lakes they used for water, in places infested by mosquitoes. Thousands died.
So it seemed that the tropics had defeated European guns, germs, and steel, and that Africans had emerged triumphant. They had evolved a complex civilization well suited to the tropical world. A civilization that had spread throughout the continent in a vast cultural diaspora.
Was this the end of European guns, germs, and steel in Africa? What would the future hold for this mighty tropical civilization? The Europeans had failed to settle Africa's land. This would become no North or South America. But Africa still had one great draw for the colonizing powers: vast reserves of natural resources, copper, diamonds, gold. European conquest and the story of guns, germs, and steel would now enter a whole new age. In the late 1800s, in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Belgians drove millions of native Africans from their villages, setting them to work gathering rubber, mining copper and other minerals. Burning their homes behind them, reducing their 1,000-year-old tropical civilization to dust and ashes. Few were as brutal as the Belgians, but across the continent, millions of Africans were compelled to abandon a way of life perfectly adapted to the tropics, and to labor for Europeans. To ferry Africa's natural wealth back to Europe, the colonizers turned again to their technology, building ever greater railroads. After more than half a century and the labor of tens of thousands, tracks of shining steel reached all the way from the Cape into the very heart of the tropics. Constructed for Europeans to extract Africa's wealth, built on the ruins of African civilization.
All this time, I've been uncovering the trail of guns, germs, and steel across Africa. And even this train and the track it rides on lie at the heart of my story. These tracks are still in use, still fulfilling their original purpose. Trains travel from the southern tip of Africa into modern Congo and Zambia, ferrying back tons of copper and other minerals. But Africa today is no longer a continent of colonies. Its nations are free and independent. What place is there for my theory of guns, germs, and steel in modern Africa?
Ndola, northern Zambia, the end of the line for Jared Diamond. Civil war in the neighboring Congo makes it too dangerous to travel the last few miles of this track. But even here, the reality of modern Africa is clear.
I'm now in the center of the African tropics, and I'm in Zambia, one of the poorest countries in Africa and really in the whole world. The average annual income here is a few $100s, and the average lifespan of a Zambian is 35 years, so I myself have now lived nearly 2 average Zambian lifetimes. What goes through my mind here is, what can history and geography and guns, germs, and steel tell us that would help us understand the plight of Zambia today? In modern Zambia, I see few signs around me of the great native civilizations that once flourished in tropical Africa. What I see instead is a country shaped by colonization. I see towns and cities that grew up next to the mines and railroads established by Europeans and built on the European model. What about the great forces that originally shaped this continent and its people? The forces behind its conquest by Europeans. Where are guns, germs, and steel in modern Africa?
In Zambia, malaria is endemic. It is the #1 public health problem. And when you look at the children particularly, when you go to a health facility, up to 45% of the children in the outpatient facility of the hospital will actually be presenting with malaria.
Germs, one of Diamond's great forces of history, are still shaping the story of modern Zambia. Not just the recent scourge of AIDS, but also that ancient tropical disease that defeated Europeans, malaria. Malaria is now the #1 killer of African children under 5 years old.
This old register will just show you the picture of the number of deaths that could have occurred within the hospital. Most of them are children below 5 years.
Yeah.
1 year, 6 months, 3 years, 5 months, 1 year. Most of them are really below 5 years.
Tropical Africans once lived in settlements spread out over large areas, which minimized the spread of malaria. But now they're living in modern, high-density cities and towns, and the rate of infection has increased dramatically. The burden of germs is one of the greatest problems afflicting the country.
Undoubtedly, malaria has a very big economic burden on us as a country. Because as you may be aware, if so many children will be suffering from malaria, if we just look at the children who are in this ward, these mothers would be working somewhere and being productive. Yeah. So that's one direct way in which we know productivity is being affected to a large extent.
It's been estimated by eminent economists that the 1% negative growth each year in Africa over the last half century can be attributed entirely to malaria.
The immunities and antibodies that Africans had developed over thousands of years to protect them from malaria no longer provide sufficient protection. The strains of the disease are mutating, and standard drugs are becoming less effective. In the high malaria season, up to 7 children a day die in this hospital.
You're used to this. I'm not. What does the scene make you feel about your work in Zambia?
Exactly. To be frank with you, Gerard, I wouldn't say I'm used to this because I don't think there's anyone who can be used to sickness and eventually death, especially of people that you love so very much and are a part of you. It is something that, in fact, I would say, because of the magnitude of the problem, one would wish to do everything they possibly could do. Because of the fact that
there's a difference between understanding something intellectually and experiencing it firsthand. In my book, germs was one of the three main forces of history, and it's impersonal, and it's still different, and it hits me to be in a place where germs are in action. "30 years ago, I set out on a journey. A quest to understand the origins of inequality in our world. I discovered that this story stretched back to the beginning of civilization and rested on the geography of our planet. When humans first started farming, one small area in the world was lucky enough to have the best crops and animals, which gave one group of people a unique advantage in history. Europeans perfected guns and steel, evolved lethal diseases and germs. They then used these tools to conquer continents and to build extraordinary wealth. I conclude that geography and guns, germs, and steel have been the strongest forces to shape the history of our world. Here in Zambia, these forces are still shaping the world today. Tropical germs are overwhelming this country and its people and driving them into poverty. Does that mean that Zambia will always remain a victim of these great forces of history and geography? And that Africa is condemned to a future as poor as its present? Absolutely not. And I would say that the message is a hopeful one. It's not a deterministic, fatalistic one that says, forget about Africa and underdeveloped areas. It says there are specific reasons why different parts of the world ended up as they did. And with understanding of those reasons, we can use that knowledge to help the places that historically were at a disadvantage.
Malaysia and Singapore are among the richest and most dynamic economies in the world. Like Africa, they are tropical countries with the same problems of geography and health, the same endemic malaria. But both transformed themselves by understanding their environment. 50 years ago, these countries realized the burden that geography and germs could be. Through concerted effort, they managed to almost entirely eradicate malaria from their land, transforming their economies and way of life. The story of Malaysia and Singapore shows what an understanding of geography and history can do.
Explanations give you power. They give you the power to change. They tell us what happened in the past and why, and we can use that knowledge to make different things happen in the future.
The government of Zambia agrees. They have set up a nationwide project to try to eliminate malaria from the country, just as in Malaysia and Singapore. New drugs, even a possible vaccine, are giving them an increasing chance of success.
The control of malaria will mean an improvement in the welfare of the people. And an improvement in the welfare of the people will mean increased productivity. And increased productivity will mean that we will be a wealthy nation, because that will mean that then people will have sufficient, not only food, but sufficient time to be able to do things that make a human being complete and whole and able to live a fulfilled life.
Jared Diamond's quest has been to understand the great forces of human history. But it is still the very smallest of details, the lives of individual human beings, that lie at the heart of his work.
When we talk about history, we talk about development, we talk about competition between societies and the wealth of nations. It can sound intellectual, but here in Africa there are human faces on it.
And for Diamond, even after 30 years of thought and inquiry, the questions behind guns, germs, and steel remain as important as they ever did. Why is our world divided between rich and poor? And how, perhaps, can we change it?
I feel that whatever I work on for the rest of my life, I can never work on questions as fascinating as the questions of guns, germs, and steel, because they're the biggest questions of human history.